There's no organization more controversial to Africa compared to the IMF. And today we're going to be talking about whether the IMF is good or evil. And I'm going to give you my opinions about it. And maybe you might disagree with them or agree with them, and I'd love to hear your comments in the chat. And if you're new to this channel, welcome to Coffee Economics. My name is Abe. So let's get into the video. So the IMF was born in the 1945s as part of the Bretton Woods agreement. And the other organization born out of that agreement was the World Bank. The purpose of the IMF is to ensure stability in the monetary systems of the world. So in a sense, it's trying to make sure that we avoid economic crises. So the key role of the IMF is to help countries that are facing issues that would plunge them into crisis. And in the case, what they do is provide loans and lines of credit so people who are facing some sort of economic crisis have enough money to ride out that crisis. So on the face of it, the IMF looks like it's an organization with good intentions. It's here to be the bank of last resort to help countries weather a storm. But even though the IMF has been around for a while, since the 1945s, like I said, before many African countries even became independent, the IMF has not had a great reputation. And maybe it's a misunderstanding or actually might be accurate. I'm going to give you the sides for and against the IMF's policies. So one of the things people need to understand about the IMF is that the IMF does not just come in and impose its will on a country. Countries have to go to the IMF to request a loan so that they can be bailed out. So at that point, it's probably is likely that those countries are facing a pretty dire situation, and they found themselves in a situation they'll rather borrow from the IMF rather than not. Given that the IMF is a lender of last resort, you'd all imagine that the IMF is probably going to come into situations that are going to be pretty dire and desperate for many countries. And that was the case post the oil crises in the 1970s and then again in the 2000s. And now again, these same crises are sort of happening because of what's happened with COVID, the COVID impacts, and then the Russia-Ukraine war putting a lot of pressure on developing countries. Many of those in Africa live up to their debt obligations, but they're struggling because the world has come into a sense of uncertainty and people are just not really wanting to invest in African countries, but rather be willing to invest in countries that they perceive as safe. So in that situation, the IMF comes in and says, hey, you guys are struggling, we'll help you out, but on conditions. So those conditions generally are in the means of trying to make the country more sustainable in the way it develops and uses its resources and the way it sets up its policies. So on the face of it, it looks like the IMF is trying to do good things, and maybe they are. And some would argue that the IMF is a puppet of the US or the Western powers used to make crises even more worse in Africa. Even though there are a lot of conditions that affect Africa in terms of how it engages with the world, in terms of how it gets money to fund infrastructure or investment, and the rates of interest that they pay for those loans that they get from those agencies, which are exorbitantly high compared to what they should be actually paying. It begs to ask the question, if we know that the world is already against Africa, to put it more bluntly, then as Africans, we should be more prepared and more vigilant and more wise about the choices that we make in terms of policy and investment choices. With that said though, there are situations where countries are in a situation where they have to borrow, and the places that they borrow from don't necessarily meet the conditions that they need for that money to be sustainable for them. But I still argue that for many African countries, what we could do is better management, better thinking about from who we borrow from, for why we borrow from them, and really critically assess that the things that we're borrowing for, are they going to generate the revenue that is needed to pay back those loans? And another thing you have to think about with the IMF is that because you're getting a loan from them, they have their own policies and the worldview of how the world should work. And because of that, those loans come with conditions. And those conditions are because IMF has an agenda, not an agenda in the negative sense, but an agenda set out in their purpose and policies that what they want to achieve is to help nations become more sustainable and be able to grow in a sustainable manner. Those conditions come in various more forms. So those conditions could be privatization of state-owned assets, could be divesting in different infrastructure projects, or it could be not spending on one type of project and cutting subsidies or increasing taxes and the like. So in a way, the IMF, even though it comes with all its policies, probably is just coming out of goodwill and trying to help nations out of a crisis. That giving those loans under transparent conditions, people know that the IMF has got a neoclassical or neoliberal agenda. So it's no surprise that they'll have conditions such as doing things that would make the economies become more like free markets. But with that said, there are some things that the IMF does not do well. And I think those are things that we need to be really critical of. For one, the IMF assumes that countries need to operate under a free market condition, and that's the best way of doing economic development. But the situation that African countries face is very different from developed countries. The economics that they employ on African countries is based on European and American economic thinking of how economies should work within their own context. So those policies and types of interventions tend to not be built for an African context. For example, modern monetary theory is a theory that would work within the context of a developed economy, but modern monetary theory would not work within an African context. Likewise, if the IMF comes with an idea to say you need to cut your subsidies to people who are receiving these subsidies either for food, for fuel, or some other thing that helps them within a developed country context, those things might not have much harm to those people because they've got other means of income or other sources to draw from to cushion that effect. But within a developing country context, cutting those subsidies can actually mean not just reducing people's reliance on that thing, but it could also mean a very real impact on what it means for their day-to-day lives. It could mean that those people aren't able to go to school if they cannot afford to fuel their car. It could mean people end up deciding to go hungry because they cannot afford the things that they need. And also with the IMF, they've had a history of wanting these policies to be enacted really quickly, really fast, without understanding the context and the economic structure of those economies. And that's had detrimental impacts on those economies in many shapes or form. I can look back to my own home country, Zimbabwe, where they were subject to a structural adjustment program, which had very negative impacts on people in terms of being able to find money or afford things or just to live lives the way they needed to live. So that a part of IMF seems to be a very painful thing because they tend to come with preconceived ideas of how economics should work within an African context, but they're exporting an idea that probably is more relevant for within a developed economic context. I also think that the IMF is in an interesting position within Africa because the IMF serves as a lender of last resort. If people request, they do tend to come to their aid. And because of that, they can end up being the scapegoat for many African countries. For example, if an African country was facing a crisis because of policies that it could have done in the past, but it ended up not doing it and left it to the last minute, and that made it fall into a crisis, they can call up the IMF. And the IMF will say, okay, we'll help you, but you need to fix up X, Y, Z for us to give you a loan. It's easy for an African government to just decide, oh, it's because of the IMF policies that this suffering is happening. If we think about it in a more detailed way, it's more likely it's because we failed to do some right policies earlier on. That's why a country ends up in a predicament where it ends up having to borrow from the IMF. So in summary, I don't think the IMF is guilt-free, but I think that the blame also lies within ourselves as Africans in the way we do economics within our own continent. If we think about it, the IMF does not need to be involved in the African development. Really, if we are to be wise in the way we do economics, in the way we structure our policy, and having the tenacity and the boldness to make sure we carry out what we've set our plans to do and do those well, I think the IMF will have less of a role within the context of Africa. But I also want to add as well before I end this video that there are some factors that also need to be considered with the IMF. There are some people who think that the IMF is just one of the kind of hitmen that come to destroy Africa. There could be the other players that are doing shadowy things within the African context to make Africa more desperate and end up going to the IMF and end up being in a cycle of borrowing and becoming more in debt. I cannot disprove or prove those factors, but it is an important thing to consider when we're thinking about what the role the IMF has had in Africa and whether it is truly evil or truly just misunderstood in a sense. But if we truly believe that it's these shadowy figures working with the IMF to make Africa be in poverty, isn't it up to us to actually think about what leadership we have and the strength of our leadership to defend against these shadowy figures, to defend against undue influence on the African economy? Isn't it up to us to make the decisions that will make us more resilient to these kind of shadowy things or needing the IMF? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and to hear whether you agree with me about whether the IMF is evil or good, or whether there is something more to this than just the IMF as well. So thanks guys for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the like button, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.